Mountain View Sanatorium was meant to be a place of healing, a sanctuary tucked deep within the mountains, where silence reigned and the air was thick with pine and secrets. But behind those crumbling walls, something far more sinister was happening. 84 patients walked through those heavy wooden doors seeking hope. None of them ever left, not because they were forgotten, but because they were silenced. This is not just a story of medicine gone wrong. It's the story of blind trust, experimental healing, and the twisted side of science. Today, we uncover what really happened inside those dimly lit corridors. Today, we confront the healing that killed. From the outside, Mountain View Sanatorium was a beacon of medical progress, a pristine facility nestled between dense pines and fog-draped hills. Built in the early 1900s, it was marketed as a haven for those suffering from long-term illnesses like tuberculosis, nervous breakdowns, and what was then known as female hysteria. Wealthy families from across the region brought their loved ones here in hopes of recovery, lured by the promise of restorative silence and cutting-edge therapies. The sanatorium boasted imported equipment from Europe and a staff that supposedly included graduates from elite universities. Its location, remote and surrounded by natural springs, only reinforced its image as a retreat far from urban decay. But what the public didn't see, and what no newspaper dared to report, was that Mountain View was never built for transparency. The earliest clues of something darker begin in the construction phase itself. According to blueprints recovered decades later, the original design included extensive underground tunnels and sub-basements that were not listed in public plans. These hidden areas were outfitted with thick steel doors, reinforced ceilings, and a plumbing system completely separate from the main structure. While the official narrative painted these additions as maintenance routes, former workers and local contractors told a different story. Whispers of soundproof rooms, of contractors not allowed to work in pairs, and of shifts that ended with blood-stained boots and bribes to keep quiet. It was as if the building was designed from the start for concealment, to operate in shadows, both physically and administratively. Once operational, the sanatorium quickly developed a reputation for secrecy. Families reported increasing difficulty in contacting their loved ones. Letters went unanswered. Phone calls were redirected or mysteriously disconnected. When they did visit, they were often denied entry without notice or told the patient was under evaluation. Some who managed to enter reported that patients seemed sedated, unresponsive, or disturbingly altered. Not just physically, but psychologically. They would sit and stare, barely blinking, whispering numbers or phrases that made no sense. The staff, cold and mechanical, would offer scripted reassurances. Some families began asking questions. Many of those who asked too loudly were abruptly told their loved one had passed peacefully in the night and were buried before the family could even identify the body. Public records about the facility became increasingly difficult to trace. In county archives, patient admission logs were redacted or simply missing. Death certificates, when available, often listed vague causes such as cardiac arrest, pneumonia, or the chillingly broad natural causes. More troubling were the doctors themselves. Many of them had no verifiable medical history. Their credentials were either fabricated or traced back to defunct institutions. A local journalist once tried to publish a piece titled, "The Ghost Staff of Mountain View," but the paper pulled it hours before print, and the journalist vanished days later, his car found parked at the base of a cliff, miles from the facility. The official ruling? Suicide. But his colleagues never believed it. What truly solidified the mystery was the silence that followed. As the years wore on, Mountain View became a local legend, a source of ghost stories and whispered warnings. Yet no official investigation was ever conducted. The police claimed jurisdictional confusion. The health department offered no audits. And despite 84 confirmed patients never being discharged or accounted for, there were no legal inquiries, no lawsuits, no headlines. The sanatorium continued to ate quietly, year after year, as if immune to scrutiny. The deeper one looked, the more obvious it became. This was not a medical facility. It was a carefully controlled black hole, where truth went to die, and where silence was not just policy. It was law. The patients who entered Mountain View Sanatorium came with hope. Hope for healing, comfort, and recovery. Most were in vulnerable conditions, suffering from ailments that conventional hospitals had failed to treat. Many were sent by families, desperate for a miracle, convinced by glowing brochures and carefully rehearsed consultations with head physicians. Upon arrival, the patients were often met with warmth and hospitality, offered calming tea blends, and taken on nature walks through the surrounding forest. But once they were admitted past the grand front lobby, into the clinical wings, everything changed. Personal belongings were confiscated. Communication with the outside world was restricted. Diaries, jewelry, even family photographs were taken for safekeeping, never to be returned. These weren't standard medical precautions. This was isolation, systematic and deliberate. What happened next wasn't medicine. It was control. Patients were stripped of their autonomy under the guise of therapeutic supervision. Nurses and doctors no longer addressed them by name, but by room number or case file ID. Consent forms were rarely explained and often signed under heavy sedation. Some patients were confined to bed rest for weeks, with no visible medical reason. Others were ordered into silence therapy, where they were forbidden to speak, not as a calming exercise, but as a method of behavioral suppression. They were treated like variables in a study, not human beings. Former staff members decades later admitted that patients were monitored for emotional responses, catalogued for how long they resisted before submitting. It was not healthcare. It was behavioral conditioning, cloaked in sterile linens. Even more disturbing was the variety of experimental procedures performed without documentation or oversight. Unmarked vials, administered at irregular intervals, were described as vitamin enhancers or new tranquilizers. In reality, many were homemade compounds, untested substances derived from early psychotropics, nerve agents, and hallucinogens. Some patients were subjected to prolonged light and sound deprivation, placed in rooms with flickering lamps or low-frequency hums designed to distort perception. Others were injected with unknown substances and kept under observation behind one-way mirrors. When they screamed, no one came. When they wept, they were told it was part of the process. These treatments weren't for the benefit of the patient. They were data collection points for a secretive research agenda no one was meant to know existed. One of the most chilling operations was known internally as treatment variant protocols. These were classified programs where patients with similar diagnoses were split into groups and given different, sometimes conflicting treatments. Not to help them recover, but to see which failed faster. Some were overloaded with chemicals. Others were intentionally denied food or water for hours, even days. A few were exposed to intense emotional manipulation through fake letters from family, read aloud by nurses who had never met the people they claimed to be. These weren't accidental oversights or malpractice errors. They were engineered outcomes. The patients were deliberately broken down to the edge of madness in order to study the speed of collapse, the limits of sanity, and the influence of stress on physical deterioration. What began as healing turned into a human experiment, a dark alchemy of fear, control, and silence. Behind the locked doors of Mountain View, the concept of patient care was reduced to a laboratory hierarchy. The staff were researchers, the rooms were observation cells, and the patients, they were living test tubes. Even the nurses, many of whom entered the facility with the intent to help, found themselves coerced or corrupted. Promotions were given not to those with the best bedside manner, but to those willing to falsify records or administer untested injections without hesitation. Those who resisted were either reassigned to the underground levels, never to be seen again, or dismissed without explanation. As for the patients, they became nameless data points, and eventually they simply disappeared from records altogether, not because they were healed, but because their usefulness had expired. In 1939, Mountain View Sanatorium introduced what would become its most controversial and destructive development, a treatment known only as Serum 7. Officially, it was touted as a revolutionary injectable formula designed to regenerate damaged neural tissue and fortify immune function. According to internal propaganda, it had been synthesized using rare plant alkaloids, hormonal extracts, and metallic nanocompounds, technology far ahead of its time. Staff were instructed to speak about it with reverence. Patients were promised miraculous results, and within weeks, over 24 individuals had been placed on a mandatory trial schedule. Yet not a single patient or their family had given informed consent. In fact, most recipients were unaware they had even received it. It was quietly added to their treatment plan, administered under sedation, or disguised as a standard vitamin injection. The first symptoms appeared subtle. Patients reported vivid dreams, moments of disassociation, and difficulty recognizing loved ones. Nurses noticed patients staring blankly at walls for hours, or whispering incoherent phrases while pacing. Within a week, some began losing control of basic motor functions, fingers twitching, legs dragging, eyes blinking out of sync. And then came the seizures, violent, repeated, and without warning. Doctors insisted these were expected side effects and simply markers of the body adapting to the serum's potency. But staff accounts recovered years later paint a more terrifying picture. Patients screaming in agony during the night, tearing at their own skin, or violently lashing out at mirrors and lights. Their minds were deteriorating at an accelerated pace, not healing. Despite these disturbing reactions, the trials continued. Some patients, in their final moments of lucidity, begged to be taken off the treatment. One woman, a former schoolteacher named Margaret Ellison, reportedly clawed the word liar into her arm during a restraint episode. Another man, a retired chemist, attempted to escape, naked and foaming at the mouth, claiming the serum had opened something in his brain that was never meant to be touched. Instead of halting the trial, administrators increased the dosage, believing the symptoms were not a failure of the serum, but a sign it was working. In their twisted logic, these horrific side effects were merely the cocoon stage of transformation, and pain was proof of progress. The sanatorium was no longer pursuing healing. It was chasing transcendence at any cost. Even the few patients who survived more than 2 months on serum 7 were far from cured. They became emotionally hollow, cognitively unstable, or physically dependent on the injections. One patient, known in files only as Subject M13, became entirely mute, refusing to eat or drink unless prompted by a coded whistle. Others developed what doctors referred to as neurological shadowing, claiming to see shapes or figures moving just behind them, visible only in their peripheral vision. These hallucinations were not dismissed. They were recorded with fascination. The sanatorium's research wing saw these phenomena as a gateway, evidence that the serum had begun altering perception itself, breaking the barriers between the conscious and subconscious, or perhaps even something far beyond human comprehension. Over time, even the staff began to fear the rooms housing serum 7 patients. Nurses refused to enter without multiple escorts. The lighting in those wings flickered constantly, and electrical failures became routine. Animals in the area, cats, birds, even insects, began avoiding the building entirely. Some medical staff reported hearing their names whispered at night, long after rounds were completed. Still, the lead administrators pressed on. New batches of serum 7 were refined, enhanced, and weaponized with unknown additives. They believed they were on the verge of unlocking the deepest corners of the human brain. But instead of finding a cure, they had manufactured something far more terrifying, a treatment that consumed the patient from the inside out, mind, body, and soul. Tucked deep beneath the main levels of Mountain View Sanatorium was a section never mentioned in brochures or staff orientation manuals, a restricted area known internally as Ward C, but whispered about among orderlies as the Whispering Ward. There were no official maps that acknowledged its location, no signs, no directional arrows, no nurses' station assigned to it. It existed only by reference, in passing remarks from senior staff, in fading legends shared during late-night rotations, and in the tremble of a janitor's voice when asked to retrieve something from downstairs. Patients who were sent there were described as non-compliant or highly resistant to therapy, but the reality was far more insidious. They weren't dangerous. They were awake. They were the ones asking questions, and the Whispering Ward was where Mountain View made sure they never asked again. Unlike the sterile, whitewashed rooms of the upper floors, the Whispering Ward was a different world. Its hallways were narrow and dark, with black-painted walls and a constant low electrical hum vibrating beneath the floor. The lighting, where it worked, flickered like candlelight, just enough to cause discomfort, but never clarity. Soundproofing foam lined much of the ward, not to protect patients, but to muffle their screams. There were no windows, no clocks, no sense of time. Patients were placed in solitary rooms, no larger than closets, often without beds, restrained to the floor or walls, left in near-total darkness. They were not visited for checkups. Food was slid through hatches. The stated goal was deep psychological reset. In truth, it was sensory deprivation torture. What made the Whispering Ward truly infamous among former staff and locals wasn't the darkness. It was the sounds. Multiple ex-employees claimed to hear faint whispers echoing through the corridor, unintelligible at first, like a foreign language spoken backward. Over time, some began to pick up patterns, repetition of patient names, phrases uttered earlier in the day, or worse, things that had never been said aloud. One nurse recalled hearing her dead father's voice coming from a ventilation duct, urging her to join them in the silence. Another orderly, hardened from years in psychiatric care, broke down in tears during an interview, stating only, "They don't whisper because they want you to hear them. They whisper because they already know what you're thinking." Staff turnover in this wing was the highest in the entire sanatorium. There are reports, although mostly secondhand, of patients who developed strange cognitive abilities during extended confinement in the whispering ward. One young boy reportedly began drawing intricate symbols and geometric diagrams across his cell walls. Symbols he had never been taught, but which resembled ancient alchemical notations. A woman in her 60s began speaking in Latin, despite never learning it, and would stop only when someone said the name Ephraim. One patient predicted the exact hour of a staff member's death 3 days before it happened. These occurrences were dismissed by administrators as delusions. But internally, they were carefully catalogued. Patients in the whispering ward weren't just being isolated. They were being watched, as if the institution was trying to observe what would emerge when the human mind was fully broken and left alone with something else. But perhaps the most terrifying part of the whispering ward wasn't what happened inside it, but what followed after. Patients who survived their time there were never the same. Many emerged mute, some blind, others completely dissociated, staring at the walls as if something still waited for them beyond this world. One man, after being released, gouged out his own eyes and wrote in his blood, "No more faces in the black." Some began mimicking the whispers they had once heard, not speaking to others, but to the air itself. These patients were often removed from the general population, reclassified as terminal, and transferred off the books. No follow-up records exist. No graves were marked, and the rooms they once occupied were bricked up, left to rot beneath the earth with only the echo of whispers trapped behind the stone. In the summer of 1957, without public notice or medical explanation, Mountain View Sanatorium abruptly shut its doors forever. No farewell letter, no press conference, no gradual winding down of operations, just a sudden, deafening silence. By the end of July, the building was fenced off, staff dispersed, and local officials issued a vague statement blaming facility degradation and administrative restructuring. But residents of the nearby town remember it differently. That summer, the mountain was alive with emergency sirens. Smoke was seen rising from behind the tree line. People claimed to hear explosions echoing across the valley, and one farmer even reported a strong chemical smell clinging to the air for days afterward, something metallic, acrid, and unnatural, something no fire from wood or cloth could have created. And yet, not a single newspaper reported on any of it. The official records that do exist, fragmented, edited, and redacted, paint a suspiciously clean picture. The fire marshal's report was one paragraph long. The death records for that week showed a mysterious spike in staff suicides and cardiac failures. The fire, they claimed, was caused by faulty wiring. But former maintenance workers say otherwise. One recalled that the building had been rewired just months before. State of the art, he said, with reinforced fuses and a brand new backup generator. It didn't add up. Whispers began to circulate among locals that the fire had been set on purpose, perhaps as a last-ditch effort to erase evidence. After all, the most severely affected, patients, those subjected to serum 7 and confined in the whispering ward, were housed in the lowest levels. It was those very levels that were never found in the wreckage, as if they had either collapsed inward or been sealed before the fire even began. In the aftermath, attempts to investigate were quietly smothered. Families of the 84 missing patients received identical letters, typed in the same font and tone, informing them that their loved ones had passed due to complications related to their condition. No specifics, no autopsies. When families pushed for more information, they were met with indifference or threats. One woman who demanded access to her brother's medical records was visited at night by men who claimed to be from the Health Oversight Bureau, an organization that no longer exists in any government directory. Her house was broken into 3 days later. Nothing was stolen, but all documents related to the sanatorium were gone. Years later, she still sleeps with the lights on, convinced that what was taken from her wasn't just paper, but truth. Truth someone never wanted her to find. Meanwhile, the land itself was quickly reclaimed by authorities. The sanatorium ruins were bulldozed within weeks, despite asbestos warnings and radiation concerns. Part of the land was declared a conservation site, closed to the public indefinitely. The foundation was poured over with concrete. To this day, no private surveys have been allowed on the site. Any drones flown over the area experience sudden malfunctions. Locals report seeing birds drop mid-flight above the tree line, as if something invisible disrupts their navigation. Even animals refuse to nest nearby. Hikers who stray too close report feelings of nausea, sudden anxiety, and auditory hallucinations, usually voices calling their name in the distance, always from the direction of where the undi, our ground wings, would have been. A few campers have gone missing entirely, their last photos showing old stone outcroppings engraved with strange spiral symbols, symbols identical to ones found in old sanatorium files. And then there are the letters, the ones that still appear, sometimes decades after the fact. A few surviving relatives of the 84 patients have reported receiving envelopes with no return address, postmarked from remote towns across the country. Inside, they find old photos of their loved ones, but altered. The eyes blacked out, the backgrounds replaced with endless dark corridors or strange script scrawled in red ink along the bottom. Others receive only a single phrase, typed on yellowed paper. They are not gone, only waiting. One man in his 80s received a tape recorder with a whispering voice, repeating his wife's name, even though she had been institutionalized at Mountain View in 1955 and declared deceased shortly after. No fingerprints, no postage trail, just the tape, just the voice, and the unmistakable sound of dripping water echoing in the background, like it was recorded underground. What happened at Mountain View Sanatorium was not just a tragic chapter of medical malpractice. It was a calculated descent into inhumanity. The institution began as a beacon of hope, but somewhere along the way, it crossed a threshold. From healing to experimentation, from therapy to torment, from science to something much darker. 84 patients never left those halls, not because they were lost, but because they were silenced, physically, spiritually, and historically. The most terrifying part is not what was discovered. It's what was never revealed. No court hearings, no public outrage, no justice. It's as if the world simply agreed to forget. Or perhaps someone made sure it did. Every photograph removed, every record destroyed, every memory scrubbed clean. But echoes remain. Whispers beneath the earth, in the trees, in the static of old radios, in the eyes of those few who lived to tell the phragma. Pines and still unanswered questions hang in the air like fog. What was Serum 7 really created for? Why was the Whispering Ward built with soundproof steel and ancient symbols? Who were the shadowed men who came after the fire? And most disturbingly, were the patients the only ones being studied? The gates of Mountain View may be sealed, the ruins buried beneath decades of dirt and denial. But what happened there didn't stay behind. Whatever was awakened, whatever was called, didn't die in the flames. Because truth, like a patient left untreated, always finds a way to rise.